Well, good afternoon. It's incredible to be here, and thank you so much for that honor. I'm particularly honored to be here with all of you because you're a group of professionals that I have very long admired. You know, decades ago, long before I got a passport, I would travel the world by going to the Dallas Public Library. It wasn't far from my home, and my mom would take my sister and me and my two brothers there, and I loved everything about the library. I love that whole, the smell when you went in of the books, the thumbing through the card catalog, even though the librarian hated it when I would go through them. And then that really satisfying sound at the end when you would thump, you'd get that stamp on your book and the due date. And the whole experience, and for me, I was so proud when I grew from the part of the library that was first, Roald Dahl, and then reading Judy Blume, and eventually I graduated to Flaubert. And libraries just open so much for us. And so as we began to do the Foundation's work years later, I got to travel to many libraries across the United States and to reflect on what libraries really do for society. And what they do is bring equal access to information. But you also do so much more than that. You say and remind us that facts matters. You challenge our worldviews. You bring communities together and change our minds through dialogue. And so in this last year, I've now been writing a book. And again, thinking a lot about libraries. And I realize that you're even more than that. You are the guardians of our stories. You protect our stories, you cherish our stories, and you pass along our stories. And that is incredibly important for society, because it's our stories that bind us together. It's our stories that help us reach out and connect. And that is how we learn and how we grow. So today, I'm going to start by telling a story. And it's honestly a story about stories. I met a woman 4 years ago. Her name is Sister Sudha. She founded an all-girls school in India for the untouchables. And the girls literally were from a community called the Musahar, which translated literally means the rat eaters. And the story that Sister would tell every year on the first day of school to the girls was about a magic pen. And what she said about that magic pen as she held it up was that when it would write, it would only tell stories about justice. And as I worked on my book, and some of those of you who are also authors and have written a lot know that sometimes the words don't come easily. And other times you feel like they just flow onto the page. And when I would sometimes think about writing in that magic pen, the stories just flowed through me. And I think, honestly, it's because they are stories that I tell in my book about other women. And I love that the stories that I'm telling in this book call us all to action, much like that magic pen. And it's those stories that's the reason that I'm here today. Those stories that women have shared with me, they've called me to action. They've shaped my life, and they've given it meaning and purpose. So I mentioned Sister Sudha because of this magic pen, but I mention her for another reason as well. One of the things she told me is that when the girls first show up at school, their eyes are almost always cast down to the ground because they had been told their entire lives that they're untouchable, that they're unworthy. And when she works with them over time, she and her staff, and they begin to see themselves as girls who can learn, what changes is that their eyes begin to lift, and their whole view of the world changes, and their view of themselves change. Isn't that a really beautiful way to think about what happens when we empower one another with knowledge? Isn't that a beautiful way to think about the work that you do every day? You're creating moments of lift. This phrase, moment of lift, it shows up a lot in my book because for me it operates on several levels. It evokes childhood memories for me of watching rocket launches. My father was an aerospace engineer and he worked on the Apollo missions. And when I was a little girl, the only nights we got to stay up late, my sister and I and our jammies, was those nights of the Apollo launches. And my favorite part of the Apollo launches was when, they've ignited the engines and you feel that rumbling and the earth is shaking. And then all of a sudden, the rocket lifts off the ground. And as a little girl, I used to kind of think, well, what happens? What allows that rocket to lift? What does it take to get those forces to overpower the forces holding us down, to pull that rocket up and let it leave the Earth and launch into space? And later in my life, I started asking that question in another way. How can I use my life to create moments of lift for other people? It probably won't surprise you to hear that a little girl who was interested in rocket launches got interested in technology in high school. I went on to study at Duke University computer science and business, and then I got hired by a then smallish software company called Microsoft. And you may have also heard that during that time I met someone at work. And I think one of the reasons that Bill and I fell in love is that we had very common shared values. From the very, very beginning, we agreed that the vast majority of resources that had come from Microsoft would go back to society. And when we started our foundation, our guiding principle as a couple, and still is, that all lives, no matter where they're lived, have equal value. Now, I have to be honest that when we started this foundation work, gender equality wasn't anywhere on my radar screen. But then I started traveling and spending a lot of time every year in the developing world, in some of the world's most poorest places. And when I would talk with women, they would talk to me about the barriers that were standing in their way. And after meeting these women and hearing their stories, there was just literally no way I could turn my back on them. I just couldn't. They were there and they'd shared their stories with me. And one of the women I met's name was Meena. I was visiting a health facility in northern India that we'd helped support, and Meena had recently given birth there to a healthy baby boy. And so I was there talking with Meena in her home about her experience at that health clinic. And she was proudly holding this baby boy and telling me about breastfeeding and that she'd bonded with this child, and she clearly loved him. And after a while, I got the courage up to ask her whether she planned to have more children. And she looked down for a very long time and paused, and I thought maybe she wasn't going to answer my question, that maybe it was just too uncomfortable. Finally, her eyes rose up and she looked me straight in the eye and she said, she was very sad, and she said, no, the truth is no, I don't want any more children. I can't have any more children. I can't feed this baby boy when I'm finished breastfeeding him. I have no hope for educating this child. No hope. My only hope is that you will take him home with you. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know where I was from, except that I was from the United States. And her story crushed me. It absolutely crushed me. And after I had taken some time, a long time after that trip, I came home and I began digging through the data. And what I found out was that 200 million women were asking us every single year for contraceptives. and we weren't giving them to them. The basic tools that we use here in the United States, we weren't delivering them in the developing world. And here I am, I'm part of working on global health. And it was so clear to me that the world needed to do something about this. So in 2012, I helped lead a coalition to put new energy and resources behind giving access, expanding access to contraceptives, voluntary access to women around the world. And that was my start as an advocate. But I quickly realized that to speak out on that topic wasn't even nearly enough. There were so many more issues. There are so many challenges that demand our attention. So in my book, I write about maternal and newborn health, access to education, unpaid work, child marriage, economic opportunity, workplace discrimination. These are the barriers we need to knock down, and they're the doors we need to open and walk through if we're really going to achieve women's empowerment. The good news is that demand for gender equality is growing louder, and it is coming from all over the world. In the US, you see it. Women are marching, they're running for office, they're breaking through glass ceilings. Around the world, governments are starting to recognize that investing in women and girls has to be a priority. In other words, the engines are ignited, the rocket is rumbling, the earth is shaking. But I want to tell you that that moment of lift, it is not inevitable. It's just not. If we want to summon a moment of lift for women and girls, a moment that will lift up all of humanity, we all need to step up. Every single one of us in this room, even if you've never thought of yourself as an advocate or an activist, and believe me, I did not think of myself as an advocate before this, I've learned that we can't stand by and wait. Someone else isn't going to come along and create this moment for us. But when we come together, we can shape what happens next. We can use our collective force, and we can prove that this is the moment. We are the moment of lift. Thank you. Now it's my great honor to welcome to the stage Nancy Pearl. Nancy?
Melinda, that was a wonderful, wonderful talk, and it made me think about how much your book moved me and how I felt so good that you were there and the foundation is there to encourage us all to do that good work that you talk about. So thank you for this book.
Thanks, Nancy. I have to say, yesterday I was talking with two friends about the fact that I was coming here. This is my first book talk, so I'm a little nervous. And the two friends said, well, can I come? And I said, well, it's really for librarians. I don't really have a lot of tickets. And they said, well, is there anybody interviewing you? And I said, Nancy Pearl. And they're like, oh, now we really want to come.
Thank you.
So Nancy's the rock star.
So why, at this moment in your busy life, with your family, with the foundation, why did you choose to sit down and write The Moment of Lift?
Yeah, I have literally been so moved by these women that I've met over the course of 20 years. And it felt like if they were willing to have the courage to share my stories, I needed to share their stories. And they're the ones that help me recognize that if we lift up women, they're going to lift up all of humanity. And this moment in time that we have with this Me Too movement, this is our moment, and we need to take advantage of it. And so I thought this is the time to tell their stories.
When you were talking about just now sharing their stories, one of the things that I thought was so good about the book is that you not only share these amazing, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes very uplifting moments with the women that you've met, the people that you've met, but you share your own story as well. And I think that in a way that really humanizes the book and doesn't make it a cookie cutter, let's do this, but it's what I learned from my life or how I live these values that made the book such a good read.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think I did that well, you've written a book. It's not easy. It's not easy to share some like intimate moments, which I do, I think, in our marriage or in our family life. But I think it really is our stories, as I said, that connect us to one another, and they connect our humanity. And so I chose in there to tell some stories about even how I had to work to get equality in my own marriage.
Yes.
And it's something that Bill and I both believe in and we wanted, but we hadn't stopped to figure out, are we actually doing that at home? And how do we go about doing it? Because I felt like if I didn't have full equality in my marriage, how could I be out here advocating for equality?
Right.
And everything I try to do in a very integrated way, the way I live my life, which is what I'm trying to teach our children at home around the dinner table or in those quiet moments, is also what I'm trying to role model in the world. Or what I'm role modeling in the world is what I'm trying to teach my kids. And when those two don't match, it doesn't feel right inside. And so, yeah, we had to work towards that.
How do you define feminism?
Well, that's a great question. I have to be honest that the first time somebody asked me if I was a feminist,
Yeah.
I had just given birth to Jen, our oldest daughter, who's now 22, but she was a newborn. And it was actually a woman, Sister Suzanne Cook, who was running Forest Ridge. She asked me to be on the board, and she asked me if I was a feminist, and I said, I wasn't sure. And I had to really think about it. But the way I define feminism is, does a woman have her full power to use her voice for herself in society and in her home? And can she grow and live into everything she hopes and dreams? And if she can, then feminism has done its job.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I'll just add to that is that I love today that there are world leaders who are willing to stand up and say they're feminists. One of them is Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. And yeah, and it's super important that men are willing to say, we believe in women, we believe in feminism, because if we are really going to change the world, if we're really going to empower everybody, we have to have men and women stay up. So stand up, go. Our son, Rory, let me write an article that I was actually surprised. I didn't know how he was going to feel about this, but when he turned 18, and I was so proud of him for many, many reasons. He had some challenges to grow through and overcome as a young boy, but I asked whether I could write an article and say that he was a feminist, because he is. I mean, he's taught me actually a lot about feminism, these deep discussions over the dinner table, and he said, absolutely, Mom, I am so proud to say I'm a feminist. I believe in women.
When you think about your childhood and your family, which was at that time, very traditional family. Your mom was a homemaker, and your dad went off to do this rocket stuff, which is fascinating in its own right. What does your mother think now about where you are in your life as a woman?
Well, I think a couple of things and I do mention this in the book. So first of all, I'm so incredibly lucky. Like, my parents have such a deep, loving relationship. I never, ever had to question when I was a child whether they loved each other, ever. And they tried very hard to always speak with one voice together. But yes, my mom was more of a traditional homemaker. My dad was out working on the Apollo missions. And she is at home raising 4 kids. Now, my dad would help out when he was home in the evening, but, he was gone most of the day. And on the Apollo missions, as she said, he was working, 12, 15, 16-hour days. But as my parents started to realize they wanted to send 4 kids to college, they realized my dad's engineer salary wasn't going to be able to support that. And they really wanted to give all of us, 4 of us, a message. There's 2 girls in my family and then 2 boys. And they wanted to give us all the message that we were college going, and somehow they would figure out a way to send us to college. And we could look around and see that wasn't going to be easy. And so my parents started a real estate property business. And my mom ended up being the one who was really running that during the day. And so she really, and teaching us how to keep the books and really working on it. My dad worked on it on the weekends and in the evenings. So my mom, even though she was originally a traditional homemaker, she was eventually a working mom. She was basically an entrepreneur. And I think today she's incredibly proud that her daughters and her sons believe in women and fully have their voice inside their marriages and out in society.
One of the things that you talk about is when you first went to work for Microsoft, and you were in the first group of MBAs that was hired, and you were the only woman. So what was that experience like for you?
It was hard. So the year before, Microsoft had hired 2 MBAs, but they weren't really thinking of it as a group. And so then the year I came along, they decided to hire 9 of us. So it was 8 guys and me. And in one sense, it wasn't that odd to me because I went to an all-girls Catholic school for high school. That's where I learned to code and that I love coding so much. I went to college. I picked a college at Duke, which at the time had a fabulous computer science program. But when I got to college, there weren't very many young women freshman year in computer science. And the longer I was in computer science, the numbers went down, 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 so that by the time I was a junior, I really don't remember hardly any women in the computer lab. So I was used to, by then, programming with lots of guys. I just got used to that. I got used to running. I actually kind of figured out I was good at running teams and managing a team of programmers in college. So in one sense, I got to Microsoft, and it wasn't that unusual that it was me and 8 guys. But on the other hand, it was tricky because the culture was just very brash and very rough and tumble. And I tell a story in the book that Microsoft had asked all of us that they had hired, this class of 9 MBAs, to come back to Microsoft before we started and to do kind of an orientation. And we didn't know it was a time for them to kind of assess which groups they were going to put us in. And so they gathered the entire large part of the organization. Large back then was like 36 people. And they were going to figure out where to place the 9 of us. And the guy sitting next to me at the table, when one of the head of the whole department, the vice president, was presenting, he picked a fight with the vice president during the presentation. And I remember thinking, okay, we're like the young MBAs here. We haven't even started, and this guy's picking a fight. And I thought, I don't know. I don't know if this is like going to be right for me. So I worked there for the first 2 years, and I would do what I think many women do, which is I assimilated. I learned how to be rough and tumble. I found like-minded female colleagues. One of them is still my very best friend. And but after about 2 years, I thought I might quit. And I took some time to really think that through. And I decided, no, before I quit, I knew I could always go back to Dallas. It was nice, a long-standing offer, a job offer there, and they would still call me on the phone sometimes, see if I wanted to come. And I thought, no, I'm not going to quit. I'll just try being myself for a while and just see how that goes. I didn't think it would work. And I started to learn that being myself actually did work and that I was much, much happier. And over time, I ended up being able to attract a lot of men to my group, programmers, teams of programmers that I was running. And people would say, how did you get that guy from that group to come to yours? And I was like, I don't know, maybe this is just the culture they wanted to work in. And so I think there was a group of us, there was a group of us that had a subculture inside the company that just really rewarded people, and they always knew I had their back.
And in the book you talk about, when you're talking about those days, you talk about talking to that brash guy about how he could talk back to and what you learned from talking to him.
I did. So years later, so this guy, years later, ended up officing next to me. And for years, this vice president would come into his office, and they would have all-out, argumentative intellectual brawls about whatever. And finally, one day a group of us were out one night, having a cocktail or something before dinner, and I said to him, "Hey, do you remember that day in orientation when you picked a fight with the boss?" And he went completely red, and he said, "I can't believe you remember that." He said, there was a professor in my MBA class who was coaching me and telling me that I wasn't bold enough. So he goes, "I was trying it out." Not a good moment to try it out. But it did teach me, too, that men are under pressure also to act a certain way. And I think that is one of the things that I'm learning, especially as we've been extraordinarily purposeful at the foundation about the culture that we have created. And I'm not saying we've got it all right, but we're very purposeful. And what I'm seeing is that it allows everyone, men and women, to show up as their full selves. And when you can show up as your full self, you're more creative, you're more innovative, you're more willing to participate. And we know that when you have diversity in product development in any area, you have better products and your sales are actually higher. And this is but one reason. I mean, this is a reason in the United States I care about gender diversity and having women's voices empowered in our workplaces. But I know this from meeting with women all over the world, that when they can use their voice, when they can stand up with their full authority and be heard in their homes and in their communities, they change culture. And one thing I know about women is they invest in everybody else, and they invest in everybody around them. So if you want to change society, you need to make sure you give women their voice. And we need to help do that. We all need to use our power and our networks, or step aside or say, "Hey, this woman at the table, she has a great idea. Let's hear on her." If you hear another guy speak over her, which I hear a lot, it happens.
Yeah. One of the strongest, a couple, let me go continue on this line of questions first. One of the stories that you talk about in the book is about you and Bill and the annual foundation newsletter, and it so relates to just what you were talking about. So could you share that with us, please?
Sure. Okay. So this is in the book, and feels very vulnerable for me to share. And my parents actually saw an early copy of the book before it was completely final, and they're like, "Are you sure you want to share that story?" But I do share it. So this is a story about getting equality in our marriage. So Warren Buffett, whose resources are given away amazingly through our foundation, said to Bill and me many years ago, "I think you all should write an annual letter," much like Warren does for Berkshire Hathaway. And he said, write it, as if you're writing it for your sister or your neighbor, so that they understand what you're doing. It was a great idea. And at the time that he suggested this idea, I just felt I was too busy with 3 little kids, a full-time foundation. Bill was still working at Microsoft. And so Bill said, "No, it's a great idea. You're right. He's right. I'll take the pen and I'll write it." So for a number of years, Bill wrote the annual letter. And I would see it beforehand, and I would give him some input, but he would write it. But the year that I mentioned earlier, 2012, when I came out with this family planning initiative to try and give access to contraceptives, voluntary access to women, 200 million women, I said to Bill, "You know what? I want to write about that in the annual letter." He had it on his list of topics, because he believes in contraceptives, to write about. And I said, "I actually want to write that section." And that initial conversation didn't go very easily. Bill was pretty used to writing the annual letter, and I had to really push. And so that year, I wrote a small section of the annual letter. And then the next year, the annual letter came up, and I said, "You know what? I really want to write part of the annual letter more." And so again, the conversation wasn't super easy. I had to push some, and I wrote more that year. And then the third year of this back and forth between us, which many couples have these disagreements between them, right, of who does what who's going to do what. I said, "I want to write half the annual letter." And now it's just a given. I write half the annual letter. And I felt at the time, I will say, you know, of course I thought I was right. You always think you're the one in the right. But Bill was good at it. He was used to it. He's like, hey, I'm used to doing this. I'm good at it. I'll keep doing it. But it helped me so much when, after we'd gotten through this and we were equally writing the annual letter, we went down to visit Jimmy and Rosalind Carter in Plains, Georgia. And just because, you know, we really respect them, and they're getting elderly. And so anyway, went down to visit them, and then Jimmy handed us a book of his that we then went on to a vacation. And so Bill is reading the book before me on vacation, and he starts chuckling. He's reading this chapter. And I said, what are you chuckling about? And he said, do you want to know what the biggest fight that Jimmy and Rosalind ever had? And I said, yeah, I want to know. And he said, they tried to write a book together, and they decided they couldn't. I was like, phew, okay, it's not just us. But, you know, I tell that story in the book because, I mean, every marriage, I think, needs to have a little bit of grist in it. You have to question your assumptions. Where have we come from as a couple, both from our families of origin, from the assumptions we brought into the marriage, even about who does what at home. And if you're bold enough to work with your spouse, which Bill and I are, and we actually love that we work together, it's a huge gift in our lives, there has to be a little bit of grist there. And it's that grist that moves us forward as a couple. And I didn't even realize at the time that we're actually role modeling for society. I tell another story in the book about one of the things I've started to talk about in our annual letter is unpaid labor. Not something Bill would have ever put in the annual letter, by the way, but this huge amount of unpaid labor that women do in our homes. And so in India, there's a gap of 5 hours a day between what a woman does in the home and what a man does in the home. And these are things like doing the dishes, making dinner. Some of them are rewarding things like childcare. Some of them are not rewarding, maybe like doing the laundry. I don't happen to love doing the laundry. But in the US, there's a 90-minute gap, still to this day, between what a man and a woman does. And so I've used some examples in the book about even Bill and me at home, because even though we're incredibly lucky, I mean, incredibly privileged, I'm lucky enough I can hire great childcare. You know, we don't need his salary or my salary, but we both want to work and we want to deeply participate in raising our children. And so when our oldest Jen was little, she was 4, and it was time to send her to preschool, we both totally agreed as a couple where we wanted her to be preschool through 5th grade long term. But our house is on one side of a bridge, and this school was a long way away on the other side of the bridge. And I said to Bill, oh, God, I can just see the years ahead, because we were hoping to have more kids. We already had 2 by then. I thought, you know, I'm going to be driving the minivan and stuck in traffic, in Seattle traffic, forever. And so I thought, let's just wait till she's like in 1st grade and put her there. And Bill was like, no, I really want her to start preschool now at this school. And so again, I wasn't particularly happy about this. And he said, guess what? I tell you what, he said, I'll drive 2 days a week. And I was like, so it meant Bill driving from our house across the bridge, drop her at school, come past our house, go back to Microsoft to go to work. And he started doing this, and a couple weeks into the school year, one of the moms kind of sidled up to me. I could see the moms all chatting, and I kind of went over there, and she sidled up, and she said, have you noticed anything going on in the classroom? And I said, yeah, it just seems like there's more dads kind of driving. She goes, yeah. We went home, and we said to our husbands, if Bill Gates can drive his kid, you can drive too. And to this day, it became such a rewarding time in the car that our youngest is 16 now. She drives me, and I go with her 1 day a week to school. And Bill goes with her about once every 2 weeks. We're both traveling a lot, but because it's just such an amazing time to connect and talk with your kids. But it is a lot of traffic.
Right, and getting worse.
Yes.
So in 2012 was when you went into very heavily into family planning and contraception, access to contraception. And one of a sentence that I was just so totally struck by in the book is where you say, and I think this was after you talked to Meena, actually, in India, and I'm quoting pretty close to what you said, which was, sometimes the greatest gift a mother can give a child is not to have another child. Could you talk about where that sentence, how that sentence, I mean, that's a wonderful sentence, and it says so much about you and so much about your experiences in the third world and where contraception is not readily available. Where did that sentence come from?
Well, I think actually besides Mina, there were two other women who just touched me so deeply on this topic. One of them was a woman named Sadie Sine, and she lives in Niger. She has 5 children. And I was talking to her. I was there in her home, talking to her about contraceptives. The kids were all around. And I said to her, she has 5 beautiful children, and I said to her about, do you hope to have, or do you wish to have another child? And she said, she looked at me like, are you kidding me? Yeah. She said, you saw my land out there. You saw it's a tiny plot. It's arid. My husband's gone off to try and find work. She's like, see my 4-year-old here? She said, it would not be fair to this child for me to have another child yet now. She said, I can barely feed the 5 that I have. And yet she knew that the little clinic that we could see from her house that was literally about half the size of this stage, very, ragged clinic, she used to be able to get the contraceptive pill there. It wasn't available anymore. And it was a crisis for her. She was mad at me, which was fine. She's like, why? Why don't you all get us that anymore? And so both she and then another woman, a woman named Marianne, who was holding this beautiful baby girl, newborn, in her arms. I was meeting with a group of women in Nairobi in a slum at a community center, and we had talked for a long, long time about contraceptives. And right before we left, Marianne stood up with this beautiful baby girl, and she said, I want to give every good thing to this child before I have another. Yeah. And those women capped for me what is universal, which is we want the very best for our children. We want them to grow up, to have an education, to thrive. When I ask people in the developing world, a mom or a dad, what are your dreams for yourself or your family? Almost to a T, every time they answer, I want my child to get an education and I want them to grow up and reach their full potential. And if we don't give access, voluntary access to contraceptives to women, they can't time and space their births. And so it becomes a crisis, and what happens is we actually lock them into a cycle of poverty. And we know that there is no country on the face of this planet that hasn't moved from low income to middle income by first making the transition through allowing contraceptives. Because when women can limit and space their births as they choose, they're healthier, their families are healthier, and we have great studies about this. The family's actually wealthier over time. Yeah. I'm going to just add one more thing about contraceptives, because this was not an easy topic for me to take on.
I was just going to ask you.
Yeah, well...
Okay, because you were raised and are Catholic, and you went to a Catholic school through high school, and your faith and your family's faith was very important to you. And what you're doing, what you began doing, was clearly against the teachings of the church. And reading the book, it struck me about how difficult that must have been for you. And you talk about that in the book, so would you share some of that with us?
That was very difficult, because I was literally going out and hearing from women. I would be there to talk about vaccines. And if I would stay long enough and listen and give them time to talk what they want to talk about, they would often talk about this shot that women particularly get in Africa called Depo-Provera. It's a type of birth control. Right. And they would say, you're here to talk to me about my children's shots. Those are so important. I get them, I stand in line for them, but what about the shot I used to get? Like, I don't know where to go. I walk for kilometers and it's not there. I walk with my children, I walk in the heat. And as I would hear from these women, there was this sort of resounding almost cry, this plea for help from the world. And that's when I came back and started digging through the data. And as I dug through the data, at first at the top line, you look and contraceptives are in stock in the developing world because of HIV/AIDS, because of what the US and others have done to make sure condoms are out there. But women have told me over and over and over again, I cannot negotiate a condom, even in my own marriage, because I would be suggesting that my husband has been unfaithful and has AIDS, or that I've been unfaithful and have AIDS. And so they need different tools at different times in their reproductive lives, like here in the United States. And what I came to realize was that we, A, weren't stocking those tools, and B, there had been a coalition around contraceptives back in the 1970s, but because of some coercion and bad things that happened in the world, and because of the political debate, primarily in the United States, we had backed away as a world from providing the #1 anti-poverty tool that women want. And so I started to realize that we needed to lead an effort around that. And it was not easy. I had to really wrestle with my faith because I grew up in the Catholic Church. I'm still Catholic. And I talked to my parents. I talked to a number of priests and nuns that I knew. And in the end, I just felt, I can't let children die. I can't let women die for a tool that I use. I mean, this is what I talk about, this living this integrated life between my values, what I counsel my children, and I knew I would counsel as they became older, all 3 of them. I thought, but I won't speak up on behalf of that when I believe in those tools just because I'm afraid, because it's controversial when I believe in the tool. And I thought, you know, I have to role model for my children courage too, and walking what my beliefs are. And so I decided to lead this coalition. And we ended up raising, it was a lot of work, we ended up raising $2.6 billion on behalf of voluntary contraceptive access. Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I was interested in is that I wondered what you thought about the fact that the liberal arts in many colleges and universities are being devalued, and some colleges are cutting out history departments, or, you know, things like that. How do you feel about that?
I feel that our history is incredibly important to us. You have to understand your history and your context in the world to reflect and to be able to figure out how you want to go forward and how you want to act. And in addition, to me, the arts open our hearts. And it's only when your heart is fully open, I think, that you can really listen. They open that other side of our brain, whether it's music or performing arts or, you know, the visual arts. And you know, before you go to college, I'm sure adults gave you advice on what to take at college or how to act at college. But adults kept telling me before I went to college, I was lucky enough to know I wanted to study computer science. But the adults in my life kept saying to me, and some that were particularly influential in my life in high school, some women who taught me humanities and history and English. I had a huge love of literature. They said, make sure you take the classes, the humanities, that you enjoy. Also, don't just take the sciences. We see that you're good at that. You enjoy math, Melinda. And I tell you, those are some of the classes that still, you know, I remember the most and that I connect with, because I think for all of us, that side of us needs to be opened. So I definitely don't think we should cut those out of our kids' curriculum, just like I don't think we should cut out PE. Kids need to move around, right? They've got energy they need to burn off, and they're better learners when they get to be their full selves.
One of the things that you and Bill shared, you discovered very early on, was you both loved F. Scott Fitzgerald. So what are you reading right now? I know you're in a book club. So.
So I just 2 nights ago finished Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, which I absolutely loved. And I feel like, I was just saying this to a friend in the last couple of days, that I feel like if you raise 3 kids, which Bill and I are doing, this is the first time in my life this fall. We just launched our son off to college this fall. It's the first time in my life where I feel like I get to read for pleasure when I'm not just on a vacation. I was like, But anyway, so over the holidays and leading up to the holidays, I've gotten to read a lot more, which I love. And Bill and I, you may have seen if you happen to follow us on one of us on Instagram or whatever, we just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. And one of the things we love to do is to read a book together. And so we chose to read A Gentleman in Moscow. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. And unfortunately, Bill is a much faster reader than I am. So I have to always say to him, don't give it away, don't give it away. But he was literally crying as he was reading parts of it. I'm like, don't tell me, don't tell me. And then I finished it a couple days later. And it's just, I loved books because I love to share. And I particularly love cultural fiction and I try to read it what I call in situ when I'm in a country. Because I feel like you learn so much about the culture or the history, if it's accurate history.
Uh-huh. But reading it as fiction, novels.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I love,
That's how
Alan
I feel.
Paton's Cry the Beloved Country.
Yeah.
Just incredible.
So when you finished editing the book, when the book was finished, or when you were almost done writing it, say, who read it? Who was Bill your first reader? I mean, did you feel you needed to get, not permission, but that you needed to, to clear it with people maybe?
Well, some people I felt like I needed to clear it with, especially if their truth, what was my version of their truth was in my story. I wanted all of those cleared by those people. But no, Bill was not one of the first ones I showed it to. He was one of the last ones I showed it to. There were 3 women who are... There are 3 women who are the ballast of my life, in addition to my family. And we walk together basically every Monday morning and have for almost 20 years.
Now, you have to say you used to jog, but as
we used
years
to jog,
went
now
by...
we walk. Every now and then we jog a couple of miles. And they were the first 3 that saw it. And I really, really wanted their input. And I knew that they would be incredibly honest with me. We've been through a lot together. We've been through marriages and children and personal challenges and death and work life. And I knew they would be really honest with me about where I got it right, where I didn't quite get it right, where I needed to change some things. And they were the first 3 that saw it. And I was very excited to get their feedback and a little nervous too, but I got incredible feedback from them. And then I sent it out to a smaller group. There weren't a ton of people who read it, and even some of the pieces about an individual story, I would just send just the story of that part. I'm sure you've done that to that person. And then Bill saw it. Bill saw it late, but certainly while I could still make edits. And he was incredibly supportive. And there was one thing he would have hoped I changed, but he was okay if I left it, and I left it. I won't say what that is. And there was another, he asked me to change a word, and I did change that word to make the story what felt like more accurate to him, a family story. But he was actually incredibly supportive.
And how do your children, well, they're not children, young adults, they're your children. How do your children feel? At what point did they read it?
Different points for different ones. I offered it to all 3 of them at the same time. And my oldest, Jen, read it immediately. My son, Rory, read it a little bit later, but both while it was still in a phase that it could be edited. And my youngest daughter, Phoebe, I told her what was in it. She said, well, just tell me what's in it about me. And so I read her the passage about her. She goes, oh, that sounds great. And it was cute. I was talking to her last night at dinner about the fact I was doing this today. And she just asked me about 2 weeks ago for a copy. And so she's actually reading it now. But I told her she can't take it to school because it's not out yet.
If a young woman asked you today what advice you would give her about making her way in the world, what would you say?
I would say absolutely surround yourself with people who will support you and will be there for you in the highs and in the lows and in the beautiful moments and in the terrible moments. Support people who will tell you the truth and who believe in you. And as I tell all 3 of my children, also, if you choose to have a partner in life, it is the most important decision that you make. And you may not realize it at the time, but it's far more important than what you do for work. That partner in life will have a profound effect on you. And I remember Bill was speaking one time at a university event with his friend Warren Buffett, and they got asked what was the most important decision they made in their life. And it was the first time Bill ever said, it was actually really sweet, he said, I'm marrying Melinda. And Warren immediately chimed in and he goes, and it was your best decision too. But surrounding yourself with key people who support you, and then if you choose to have a partner in life, choosing very, very carefully.
I know, like Nicholas Kristof, who is one of my heroes, I asked him when I interviewed him I said, how can you remain an optimist in a world that is so needy for so much? So I'd like to ask you that same, we have about 4 minutes, so take all that time and talk about how you remain an optimist, because I think that's a message that we could all grow from hearing that.
Do you want to go first? Do you want to talk about how because you've clearly thought about this too. I'm happy to answer, but why don't you go first?
Because I am a pessimist who...
Well, then we need to talk backstage.
So that's why I was dying to ask you this question.
So, look, you can read the headlines every day, and believe me, I pick up my phone and read, what comes through on the phone, and you're just like, wow. And so if you think short term, you can definitely get pretty negative. Or when I'm out in the developing world, I see a lot of very harsh things, and I write about some of these, including female genital cutting and early child marriage. But I feel like you have to take that in. You can't turn away from it and say that doesn't exist, or that's not happening in my country, or women are being treated equally. No, we're not. 127 women are in Congress. That's awesome. But that's only 24% of Congress. We're not at 50%. So you can't turn away from it. You can't resist it. You actually have to feel it and let the pain of that come in. And so when I hear these heartbreaking stories in the developing world, or even from a young woman who feels like her career was stunted in the workforce because she was discriminated or harassed, you have to let the heart break in and feel it and sit with it for a while. And then you have to, I think, push back with action. And you have to find a group around you. And sometimes it's a group of people you didn't think were going to be in your coalition. You didn't think they were going to be on your bus. You may have had a difference of opinion about them in your past. But you get them on your bus and you all start moving together. And what I know is that it's people who change the world. There's one of my favorite quotes that I came across in global health early on was from Margaret Mead, an anthropologist. And she said, never underestimate the ability of a group of committed individuals to change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. And I believe in the power of a group of committed individuals to change this world. And that's what I would ask all of you when you read the book, is think about your role in society. Think about how you want to make sure you have, if you don't already, equality in your home, equality in your community, equality in your workforce. Take a young woman under your wing. Make sure you open your network to people of color. Make sure if you're in a privileged position, you use your voice or your time or your energy. We all have ways to contribute, men and women, but it's only with our contributions that we're going to change this world and give women and people of color their true equal place. And believe me, we're going to be better off as humanity. And when I see it happen, it's one of the most beautiful things you can see in the world. And that makes me optimistic.
Melinda, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nancy.